among you. I will shake hands with other men, grasping firmly with my opposable thumbs. And when I see a man or a woman or a child in trouble, I will offer my hand to him, to her, to you, to the world. I will be a good citizen, a good partner in the endeavor of life that we all share.
This dog is too smart.
My name's Enzo, and this is my story.
So you're a race car driver. So smart. I think someone's been hurting outside. Oh, Enzo. You're nasty.
That's what our guest speaker is going to talk about, life, being a good citizen, extending your hand to your fellow man. He's going to talk about honesty and ethics, professionalism. Before I introduce him, here's an honesty and ethics Gallup poll. The most highly rated professionals. This is from a couple of surveys. They do it every year. One of the surveys that I have the data for is 09, and I have the 2012 data. They don't change much. Again, it's a Gallup poll of citizens. It's not necessarily whether it's true or not, but it's what the public thinks of the different professions. They think that the most honest, highly rated, and ethical people are nurses, druggists or pharmacists, medical doctors, engineers, dentists, police officers, and college teachers. And they're in red because the police officers were up here above engineers, and in 2012 they dropped down. I threw college teachers in there because they were included in the 2012 survey. But those are your top ones from the poll. And then the least well-rated professions. What do you think?
Lawyers. And lawyers.
Aerospace. Careful. We have a lawyer in the room.
Politics. Pilot.
Car salesmen made it to the top of the list this year. It used to be members of Congress.
Yes.
They just moved down below car salesmen. Advertising practitioners moved up above stockbrokers and HMO managers.
Senators.
Basically displacing senators. Senators were there, they moved down on the list a little bit at least.
No,
They're different. Members of Congress are different than senators. Insurance salesmen were in that group of least ethical and honest. So that's what the public thinks. And today on ethics, again, it's chapter 9 in the text, Embry-Riddle text. And our speaker today is going to be, I'll use the term, he doesn't like it, Dr. David Charles Holloman. Sometimes attorneys use Esquire on the end. He is retired. The reason I say doctor is the first doctorate that were ever issued in England were to the law profession, before the medical. But most lawyers don't use the term doctor. But I relate this story only because right after I received my doctorate, I turned to my dad and I said, "You can now call me Dr. Hewitt." And he turned to me, wanting to probably smack me, and said, "I was a doctor long before you were born." His email address he still uses, dchlaw@DeSoto.net. He was admitted to the Florida bar in 1959. He retired in 08. I keep kicking him because he could have waited one more year and got his 50-year pin with the Florida bar, but he says he has no room on his den wall. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School. And with that, Mr. Holloman, the floor is yours on the Code of Ethics. he has his presentation. I'm
Where
gonna
do you
try
want
and,
it? Here?
that's fine.
All right.
I'm gonna try and follow along with the PowerPoint so that you have some of the information that he's gonna present.
I think this Esquire, after a name that sometimes people offend the lawyers, I believe that Esquire comes from equus in Latin, which meant horse. And nobody specifies when they use Esquire after a lawyer's name, what, if they were doing all the horse or just part of the horse. Just thought I'd point that out. And I don't get a laugh out of that?
I think they missed that one.
Huh?
I think they missed it.
No.
I'll get it.
Never mind, I tried. Okay, and I was really afraid, talk about ethics, I was afraid Dr. Hewitt was gonna make me compete with that dog. And that wouldn't have been fair at all, because I like dogs.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna read you the preamble of the Code of Ethics for Engineers. Engineering is an important and learned profession. As members of this profession, engineers are expected to exhibit the highest standards of honesty and integrity. Engineering has a direct and vital impact on the quality of life for all people. Accordingly, the services provided by engineers require honesty, impartiality, fairness, and equity, and must be dedicated to the protection of the public, health, safety, and welfare. Engineers must perform under a standard of professional behavior that requires adherence to the highest principles of ethical conduct. Now, ethics is about something even more ambitious than the preamble to the Code of Ethics for Engineers that I just read. It's about how you ought to live your life. And you guys are just about ready to graduate from high school and go on. So how are you going to live your lives? Most of ethics and morality can be boiled down to one simple concept that can be expressed using the word ought. Good or right actions are actions you ought to do. Wrong or bad actions are actions you ought not to do. Pretty simple concept. If you ought to do something, this means that you can do it. Neither you nor anybody else would suggest you do something that is impossible for you to do. What you ought to be able to see about ought is that the most basic claim in ethics is on the assumption that you are free to follow the ought, to choose the ethical life. You have the ability and the freedom to choose that. Because ethics demands what you ought to follow, the right path to have, you can choose the ethical life. And I'll attempt to give you some rules to guide you in determining what you ought to do or ought not to do. You should all be familiar with the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, that rule is not exclusively Christian, although Jesus said it. I'll give you some examples from other cultures. You see, from Hinduism, this is the sum of duty. Do not do to others what would cause pain if done to you. From Plato's philosophy, and Plato was a Greek philosopher who lived some 300 years before Christ. May I do to others as I would that they should do to me. All right, and then, whatsoever you would that people should not do to you, do not do that to them. That's from Judaism. And then, this is the sum and substance of my advice. Treat your inferior as you would be treated by your superiors. Roman Stoicism. What I do not wish others to do to me, I also do not wish to do to others. And that comes from Confucius, who lived in China some 2,500 years ago. So, the golden rule is a rule that has been around 2,500 years. Not as long as civilization, but it probably predates even Confucius. It just wasn't written down. It's a good rule, and it's a simple rule. It's short, clear, simple. It appeals to common sense, of course. You want people to treat you well, don't you? So you treat others well. That's simple. It has obvious and immediate practical importance, because if you treat others badly, you probably won't get it back, right? So it's an advantage, treating people well, as they'd like to be treated, as you'd like to be treated. Now let's take a look at promises. Promises are by word, of course, by handshake, by contract, verbal or written, by constant behavior. By constant behavior, I mean if you do something for somebody over a long period of time, they get used to you doing, depend on you to do it. Then if you decide to quit doing it, you got to tell them, of course. Don't make somebody dependent on some action of yours and then quit doing it without telling them. Sure glad it don't flies in here. Okay. Always keep your promises. Be known as a person who does so. Don't make promises lightly, and you make one, keep it. Okay? So act that you use other people. You use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end, not as a means. Don't use people in the ways they would never agree to, even when that person's yourself. See, use people as ends, not as means. Okay. Shakespeare said in Hamlet, "To thine own self be true, but you always have an absolute duty and obligation to be true, not only to yourself, but to others." As a simple example, if you agree with some friends that you're going to a movie at a certain time on a certain night, and then you receive an offer to do something else that night, which you find more appealing than the movie and friends, you then at least tell your friends that you won't be able to go with them. But are you using these friends as a means or an end? I submit that you are using them as a means. They were your backup for entertainment on that particular night, but you were quite ready to abandon them when something else for that night turned up that was more to your liking. And of course I'm speaking of a Friday or Saturday night, because I know all the rest of the night you'll be studying.
Of course.
Of course. If you break a promise, you're treating someone else, the promisee, as a means to get what you want. Keeping small promises. That's what we're talking about, not big promises, small kind of promises. Keeping small promises are important. If you say that you will be at a certain place at a certain time, be there. The golden rule applies in little thing about being on time. Now I might suggest, son, please quit that. That's hard on your speaker. Yawning. See, Dr. Hewitt sent me in the middle of the afternoon. I understand. I have yawned before professors also. Pass myself. All right, you say you'll be at a certain place at a certain time, be there. The golden rule applies in little things about being on time. But there is one thing, this is all men here, so I'm not going to get in trouble. There's one thing that we men can do nothing about. Now, let's say you have a date with a young lady, and you're supposed to be at her house at 7 p.m., you see. All right, you're expected to be there, and I and Dr. Hewitt expect you to be there at 7 p.m. but we all know that she isn't gonna be ready, is she? You're gonna have to wait at least 20 minutes when you get to sit there and talk to her parents. That's character building. You don't have to like it, but I had to do it and you had to do it. That's what we have to do. What would it be like to live in a world where everybody told the truth? It'd be a little unpleasant sometimes. Sometimes we'll tell white lies, but if we all told the truth, we could get by, couldn't we?
Yeah.
Get by. What if everybody lied? Everybody lied, we'd be in a lot of trouble. You couldn't have a decent society. You couldn't work if everybody lied. So sometimes when you're thinking about what you should do or not do, think about whether everybody in the world acted like you do. Think about that. That's just something to think about when you're doing this. Plato, who lived from 427 to 347 before Christ, was a citizen of ancient Greece, and he showed that 4 main virtues exist. Temperance, which here means self-discipline, wisdom, courage, and here we're talking about not only physical courage, but moral courage. And in our time, most of the time, it's moral courage that we will be called on to use, and justice. He pointed out the first 3, self-discipline, wisdom, and courage, when properly developed and balanced, result in the 4th, justice. He then showed how in the individual and in the state, the parts corresponding to each of these virtues must play their proper role in order for justice to result. When the parties play, the citizens play their roles, the individual and the state are just. Aristotle was a student of Plato. He was a teacher of Alexander the Great. And sometimes people wondered if he did such a good job with Alexander, but Alexander did conquer the world, so I guess he did. Now, although Aristotle is a virtue ethicist like Plato, and I think, and I'm not sure about this, but just thinking about this, I think virtue ethics is summed up in the Golden Rule, I think. But don't answer it that way on the test, because there might be an error. The phrase virtue ethicist, or virtue ethics, is not in my dictionary. But remember, I use an old-fashioned, great big 10-pound Webster, so you all and your mechanical stuff may fine. Okay. Aristotle stressed habits. In other words, he put the emphasis on the importance of cultivating habits in successfully directing a person to live in accord with ethics and human excellence. Good habits. And you want to try to cultivate good habits and not bad habits, because as we all know, and you guys at your age know, habits are hard to break. You all may be fortunate, you see, because you go to school with girls, so hopefully your language is better. I went to a men's college, the language wasn't so good. Not too good. I don't know if there's any men's colleges. John Stuart Mill was trying to promote the maximum good for the maximum number of people. His philosophy, as I recall, was called utilitarianism. Now, another point to keep in mind is confidentiality. You want to be known as a person where other people can tell you things and you don't tell. You keep quiet about it. Lawyers are ethically required to keep their client's business confidential, as are medical doctors. Engineers would be more required if they work for another company to keep proprietary information confidential. That would be information developed within the company that is a benefit to the company and you don't want your competitors to know about it. It makes a lot of sense. But be a person in which others can confide in you and trust that whatever they tell you is kept confidential. Now, there are exceptions to this in lawyers' ethics, for example, and I'm not practicing anymore, but if a client comes in and tells me he's planning to go out and shoot somebody, I gotta call the sheriff. And if somebody tells you that, you gotta call the sheriff too. So there are always exceptions to the confidentiality. Okay. Now I'll talk about the word duty. You know what Ogden Nash said about duty? He said, "Oh, duty, why hast thou not the visage of a sweetie or a cutie?" I probably shouldn't have put that in there. But it isn't in the, but I thought I would anyway. But duty is far more serious than Ogden Nash wanted it to be. A great engineer who, among other engineering projects, worked on the levees of the Mississippi River, protecting the port of St. Louis, and whose levees, I believe, are still in operation, said this about duty. Duty, then, is the most sublime word in our language. Do your duty in all things. You cannot do more, and you should never wish to do less. And the person, the engineer who said that, is better known as a general and was Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Now, I submit that as an ethical person, now we'll talk about talents. As an ethical person, you have a duty to develop your talents. I don't know what talent you may have. You may have the talent to do engineering, and I believe you have an ethical duty to fulfill that talent to the best of your ability. You may have a musical talent, and you should develop that talent. It may not be the way you make your living, but you should develop it because it can give you pleasure and other people's pleasure. And if you have that talent, like any other, develop it. There are many other talents which people have. And if you have them, it is your obligation to use such talents not only for yourself, but for other people. Once again, I mentioned Immanuel Kant. That's Skippy. Anyway, he said it would just be unethical simply to be lazy and do nothing in your life, to have a useful talent, but not be willing to put the effort forth to develop it. That could be unethical. On the other hand, now you may have no talents, in which case, and you still got to make a living, you can become an attorney. I think I skipped something here.
No.
No? Okay. Now then, in your case book, I want to talk about that Aloha Airlines flight where the fuselage broke loose. You're familiar with it. If you'll recall, it's case study number 1, where a section of the fuselage in the air separated from the aircraft. The case study states that the #1 flight attendant was near the opening left by the separation of the aircraft skin and was immediately swept out of the cabin.
Oh, okay.
She was the lone casualty. I submit that there is far too little mention of this lady because of engineers, architects, designers, poor work, because of not checking on the part of the aircraft on the part of the aircraft owners. A lady died. She died due to improper review and improper maintenance. The life of somebody is taken from them. And remember that you, as possibly engineers, maintenance workers, whatever you do in a field of construction, airplanes, designers, you literally hold the life of people in your hands and you must have both ethics and excellence in your work. If not, there might come a day when you can't look yourself in the mirror because some terrible tragedy might be your fault. And case study number 2. There, 2 young men were friends, but one was a lot better student at the course they were taking than the other student. As you recall, whether the poor student received a passing grade depending on his grade on the final project, and he asked his friend to provide him with a copy of the friend's final project. They both turned it in, and the instructor realized what they had done. Both received a 0 for the project. The good student received a B in the course, and the poor student received an F. In my college, I graduated in 1956, not 1856. We were required to write the word pledge at the end of every paper or project, which meant that we had neither received nor given help. Had the same situation occurred at my college, both students would have been guilty of cheating and lying about it. They lied when they wrote the word pledge and would have been expelled, which I submit would have been the proper punishment, not only at my college, but in the example we're talking about. There is absolutely no excuse for cheating, lying, or sleeping in class. I just added that. Okay. Now, I'll read you a case study which isn't in your book. A proper action by an architect and engineer. Not in the book. You better pay attention because Dr. Hewitt's going to give you a test on this thing. The City Court building in New York City was a towering achievement for architect and engineer William LeMessier. At 59 stories tall, it was built on 4 stilts to accommodate a pre-existing church on the corner of the block. To stabilize the design, LeMessier designed a system that would displace weight to a system of chevron braces through the building. And if I ever go to New York, I'm going to go take a look at it. It must be quite a sight. All looked good when the building was completed in 1977, but appearances were deceiving. After receiving a question about the construction of the building from a graduate student, LeMessier found something frightening. Instead of welding the braces to the rest of the building as its design called for, the braces had been secured using bolts. A design that was supposed to be able to withstand hurricane-force winds could in fact only sustain 70-mile-per-hour winds, and it was hurricane season. LeMessier weighed his options and the risk to the people of New York City. Admitting to the flaw would be devastating to his career, but the disaster was too great for him to fathom. Fixing the design would be incredibly costly, and going public threatened to throw people into a panic. With all this in mind, LeMessier immediately started to make plans to get the braces strengthened. He convinced Citicorp and the City of New York to allow the fix to occur in secret, and hundreds of welders worked around the clock to install patches that would make the building safe. The building was fixed and New Yorkers went safely about their business. Also, Citicorp, and to give them credit, had to pay for all that construction, which I'm sure was a great deal. In a lesson to professionals everywhere, LeMessier didn't stubbornly refuse to see the flaws in his work or cross his fingers and hope work fears wouldn't materialize. As a result, his humility, skill, and courage are now celebrated in engineering textbooks and ethic textbooks alike. Professionals can't always avoid making mistakes, story of the city court building shows that they can make ethical, honorable, and even heroic responses to those mistakes. Now, this building was built 35 years ago, if I figured it right, and it's very timely now because, of course, New York's just had that hurricane, you see, and I'm sure there are people still alive, I don't know about Lemessier, people still alive who knew that these braces were fixed. And some people working in that building, I'm sure they're all very happy that that was done. Since I mentioned my college, I will tell you of an incident where stupid behavior on my part and a friend's part resulted in proper but perhaps serious punishment. In the fall of 1954, my best college friend, Kerry Spears, and my best friend, later I was in his wedding, which was in Mobile after we graduated, and he was in mine over in Sarasota, so we stayed friends all of our, well, Kerry's been dead for a number of years, but all our lives. And he was real smart, a lot smarter than me. And we were taking a course, a philosophy course from a professor named Abernathy. Our class period was in the afternoon, starting at 2:30 and extending to 3:30. One class period, Dr. Abernathy could not be present, but left us a recorded lecture. The World Series was being played at that time on that afternoon, and we knew that Dr. Abernathy wouldn't be there, so of course somebody brought a portable radio. We did have radio in those days. Brought a portable radio, and we, of course, played the lecture and ran it through so Dr. Abernathy would know that we played it and listened to the ball game. And Kerry and I listened too. Next class period, Dr. Abernathy gave us a test on his lecture that was recorded and played, and we all flunked. Okay? Kerry and I both received a C+ for the course. And Kerry told me later that was the lowest grade he received at Davidson College. To say he was smart. It was not my lowest grade. But now, listening to the lecture was not unethical. It was just stupid. Just as I can't make you all listen to this lecture, but you might get a test on it, you see. As I was thinking about this incident, Kerry died 5 or 6 years ago. His career was mainly teaching medieval history at the University of Florida. He majored in the classics, Latin and Greek, and he could read Latin about like you and I and all of us read English. That was one of his talents, and he certainly developed. Now, I think, looking back on it, Kerry could have been inducted to Phi Beta Kappa, the National Honor Society. To be inducted to Phi Beta Kappa, you have to have a really high grade average, you see, at your college or university. He wasn't inducted. And I just think it's possible that that C+ kept him from being inducted to Phi Beta Kappa. And a university, very important for a university professor to have a Phi Beta Kappa key. They put it, they have to carry a watch, put it on a watch chain, and make sure people see it. And Kerry didn't have it. And I just, thinking back on that, Kerry and I gave in to peer pressure. And we have no excuse for it. We weren't freshmen, we were juniors. We didn't care for baseball much anyway. Why did we care what the other guys in the class thought about us? We should have insisted on listening to that lecture, and here I am, 57 years later, still concerned about it. You see? Somewhere in here you'll find I've said ethics makes you follow, being ethical, doing the right thing, doing what you ought to do, makes you free. Well, one thing it makes you free of is thinking about something you wish you hadn't done 57 years ago. It's a minor thing. Minor for me, but not possibly for him. Later in life, let me just tell you about this guy. Later in life, Gary got to go to Europe quite a bit. He took the kids over there. Later in life, he was very proud of the fact that he had a library card to the